I'll be glancing at this occasionally to request this.
Sure, sure. That's fine.
All right. All right, good. Tell me what years you worked in Atlanta and how old were you at the time and what you did there?
Okay. I worked in Atlanta at the SNCC office from the autumn of 1963 to December of 1964. It's probably about 14 months altogether. And there were three things I was involved in. Initially, I used to write down the reports from the field offices of SNCC and from what we call the wide area telephone service, and just check on what was going on in particular places where SNCC had a presence. So that ranged from Danville, Virginia, to the Mississippi Delta, to Southwest Georgia. I also worked in the production department, which is the unit of SNCC that produced leaflets, pamphlets, posters, particularly, but not only, during the Freedom Democratic campaign in Mississippi in '63, and then every other kind of initiative. That department also was responsible for putting out the Student Voice, which was the newsletter which Julian Bond edited of SNCC. So, and later I worked in the research department of SNCC, which we were looking for the connections between the various economic elites in various parts of, the South, for example, Jackson or the Gulf Coast or wherever, and sort of seeing the connections between those who ruled and what kind of political power they had. This was I think what was later called white power structure research. So I was involved in that. I was 20 years old. I had just turned 20 in the end of September '63. So I left when I was 21.
And then how did SNCC differ from other organizations like CORE and SCLC?
Well, I'm not sure, but one of the appeals about SNCC was that not only was it led by African Americans, which the other two groups were too, but it was a youthful group, and I think Jim Foreman, who was the executive director of SNCC at the time, was probably a grayhead at the age of 30 plus. Everybody else was in their 20s and mostly in their early 20s. I mean, they were older than me, but not by much. So it was a place of young people.
And then, and what resonated with you about SNCC? Like, what drew you to SNCC?
Well,
Being 20.
well, yeah. I mean, there is that part of it. It was an adventure for sure. But it was clear that SNCC was the cutting edge of the civil rights movement. That they were the ones, picketing on the streets. They were working in the toughest parts of the South, the Delta, Southwest Georgia, parts of Alabama, and they had a certain flair and a lawn that it was just terribly appealing, and I was drawn to it very much. The energy, and plus the cause was righteous. So.
And then you also mentioned just a minute ago about The Voice, which later I believe became the Atlanta Inquirer.
No, the Inquirer was actually a separate, independent, black-owned paper. It was the reason I know that is because as a sideline, for a little additional money, I did proofreading for the Inquirer. So it was not it was not, one didn't transform into the other. They were separate publications.
Gotcha. So, well, how important was the Atlanta Inquirer as an interest informational tool back then? Because, this was before internet or anything else.
Well, it was very important. I think it represented.
Oh, excuse me. So start over and listen to say the Atlanta Inquirer.
Yeah, that's what you're talking. I mean,
Yes.
yeah, no, that's.
Include that in your answer.
Yeah.
They won't hear my questions.
Okay. The Atlanta Inquirer was an important independent black voice in the community, and I think it was more reflective of what was actually happening in the civil rights movement. I mean, you had, as I recall, the Atlanta World, which was an older black-owned paper, but I think it was a much more traditional publication, not as well oriented toward what was happening in the civil rights movement at that time, and so it was a very interesting thing to see. I mean, I wasn't, like I said, I just had a sideline job. I did proofreading for the paper, so that was it.
Okay, and then earlier you said that you were, you could speak on the appeal for human rights.
Well, I don't know how much I could speak on it, but early on in the time I was at SNCC, I did some leafleting for the committee. It was called the Committee on Appeal for Human Rights, and that was the student civil rights group at Morehouse. And this is my little contact with history. There was an event to which Martin Luther King was going to speak that evening at the chapel at Morehouse. And so I was leafleting outside the chapel, and who should, of course, come through the door but Martin Luther King. And so that I think was the closest I've ever come, to Dr. King. So that's I knew the director or the student leader of the committee on appeal. His name was Larry Fox, and I got to connect with him later when I think he later moved to Michigan, and when I later worked for the American Friends Service Committee, we connected again. So.
And then what is your fondest memory being a part of SNCC?
Well, there were a lot. I mean, there certainly was the camaraderie of the group itself. And I think even early on, as naive as I was, I think I had a sense that, we're involved in something huge here, making change. Certainly looking back on it, I feel that very, very much that the thing that one of the many things I learned there was that the important thing, I mean, I was part, a very small part of a movement that was based in the poorest and most despised community in the country. And they changed the country. And they basically began a whole process of social change in the country. I mean, not just among African Americans, but almost every major social movement since then. So, and I was a part of that. That feels very good to me.
And then it's 4 decades later. How has being a part of SNCC changed your life?
Well, I mean, part of it is what I just said, of course, but it made me both skeptical of the notions of, that we live in the greatest, most democratic, freest country on earth. I mean, so I became kind of immune or more skeptical from that point on. But also it showed me the power of organization, that the important thing was to organize. It didn't matter what the levels of education were, or, if you came out of poverty or any of that. But the important thing was that you had to address your condition